Press the Attack is still MissFortune's most popular keystone, as it works greatly with her traditionally bursty trading patterns. But due to the change to MissFortune's Q spell, now scaling with attack speed, more and more Korean challenger players are switching over to Lethal Tempo, and for good reason. The keystone is crazy strong on MissFortune ever since her mini rework, because MissFortune no longer gets punished for getting more attack speed. It actually turns her into a true late game hypercarry, and I will now show you exactly, step by step, how this new style of MissFortune should be played. The most successful rune page for MissFortune in Korean Challenger is Lethal Tempo, Overheal, Legend Bloodline and Cutdown, with Boots and Biscuits secondary. I will show you why these runes are optimal while we are looking at actual in-game examples. The same will be true for the item build, but here is the quick overview first. You want Kraken Slayer and attack speed boots, then get another crit item and a third item Infinity Edge for perfect scaling. Lord Dominic's Regards second is the most damage you can get, and tanks will hate you for it, but Bloodthirster second is also very strong. You start the game with W, get 3 points in Q for lane, and then max W at level 10. It is the best way, and here's why. W gives you a stronger leash for your jungler, and it allows you to push the first wave to get level 2 advantage. But most importantly, attack speed is simply the strongest combat stat in level 1 fights, and it is especially strong with Lethal Tempo, allowing you to fully stack your keystone much faster. W and Lethal Tempo actually turn MissFortune into an extremely scary level 1 skirmisher, and the enemy has to respect it. Even strong early game all-in champions like Nautilus need to keep your damage potential with Lethal Tempo in mind, and they cannot go for level 1 hooks on autopilot without facing major repercussions. But especially the higher you get on the solo queue ladder, the less often your enemies will make mistakes like this. Or quite frankly, level 1 fights are rare in general, and in most games they will simply not happen. However, here you switch to plan B and use W to get level 2 advantage before your enemies do. Very few AD carries are actually able to match MissFortune's level 1 W push, and if you get level 2 a mere second before they do, it will already be too late for them. In early fights like this, every auto attack holds a lot of weight, and since you get to attack first with level advantage, the MissFortune lane will always win here. In this clip, even the enemy jungler shows up to try and save the situation, but the health advantage is so big and MissFortune's consistent damage with W and Lethal Tempo so threatening that even the challenger Viego can't do anything about it. Another detail that should also not be overlooked is the fact that for the longest time, MissFortune was most commonly played as an AD caster with Emax and Arcane Comet. The rework, however, shifted a lot of power away from her spells and into her auto attacks, and people are simply not used to that. Their experience over the last season has conditioned them to consider a low mana MissFortune simply a sitting duck that cannot fight back. But this is just not true anymore, as auto attacks don't cost anything, making this new style of Lethal Tempo MissFortune much more menacing even when out of mana. However, we do need to keep in mind that the decision to play crit MissFortune with Lethal Tempo instead of press the attack doesn't come without its opportunity cost. It's not strictly better in all situations, but you have to actively create those situations in which it is. Especially your early game burst damage will be much lower without press the attack, and you will miss out on a potential kill here and there because of it. And while Lethal Tempo definitely scales better than press the attack, even in the late game, there will be situations in which the burst damage from PTA could have scored a kill where Lethal Tempo falls short. But once you get used to Lethal Tempo's playing patterns, the trade-off will be well worth it, and even press the attack does have some unique problems, even in ideal scenarios. The biggest one is that MissFortune wants to switch targets whenever possible to maximize value from her passive, but press the attack requires you to hit the same target multiple times. With Lethal Tempo though, you can use MF's passive as much as you like for maximum efficiency. In short, stacking Lethal Tempo is very easy for MissFortune, as it doesn't force you into weird and unnatural playing patterns. Yes, PTA is strictly more value at 3 autos, but after that the value from Lethal Tempo gets exponentially bigger, which means every exchange in lane will eventually reach a tipping point. If you kite correctly, the damage output of a MissFortune with a fully stacked Lethal Tempo in combination with her W and her short cast time Q is simply unmatched. And while bursting down squishy lane opponents is more likely with PTA, burst damage actually matters a lot less once the other 3 enemy champions come into play. With their level advantage, bursting these solo laners down is just not an option, and they could just run you down and kill you. Lethal Tempo Misfortune, on the other hand, has a much easier time dealing with these champions, giving you much more agency throughout the game. But the most important thing for you to keep in mind is that you want to play a slow lane phase, since the lack of burst damage is most noticeable during the early game. The idea is to apply pressure from a safe distance with Misfortune's passive and Q bounces, 1 Q at a time. This is also why you want the 3 early points in Q and the Rune Biscuit delivery, since this way the strategy has better payoff and consistency. The slow pace in lane lets you win the war of attrition and creates more situations in which you end up with better resources. When you follow this much slower game plan, you will be able to win every lane with sheer health advantage, since the enemy will never be able to challenge you with an all-in. It's a very simple strategy, and the only thing it really requires is some patience from your part. Lethal Tempo Misfortune is a late game hypercarry, but when you use her tools in lane efficiently like this, she also cannot be shut down during the early game, which is a hypercarry's weakest stage. However, all of this only applies before you hit level 6, since Misfortune has one of the strongest level 6 power spikes in all of bot lane. Playing slow here would be a waste, as you all of a sudden have a lot of kill pressure even without stacking Lethal Tempo. Naturally, Misfortune's ultimate is most dangerous when paired with your support's crowd control, oftentimes winning the lane on the spot. But even without help from your allies, Misfortune can still go for solo kills in lane with a well-placed ER combo. If you catch them off guard, no champion will be safe from this all-in. The only true counter to this is either flashing out, or if the enemy has a mobility spell like Tristana or Ezreal. But while you certainly like assistance from your teammates, the reverse is also true, since Misfortune can also create opportunities for her allies by engaging with her ER combo. The general rule of thumb, however, is that you should still try to auto-attack and play around your lethal tempo even after level 6. Pressing ultimate when you could also simply auto-attack your lane opponents would be a waste, since your ultimate has much longer range than your autos. Therefore, it is optimal to save it until the enemy gets out of your auto-attack range, so you have your ultimate available as a strong finisher. Additionally, with lethal tempo and crit items, you are much less reliant on your ultimate, since you can still fight with just your basic attacks. This frees you up to cast Misfortune's R for utility, for example safely unfreezing a frozen wave to resolve an unfavorable 1v2 situation. And what works in lane, of course, also works in the mid-game. Misfortune's ultimate is effectively a death zone for the enemy, and they will try to avoid it at all costs. This allows you to create a safety zone for your teammates should they be overextended. The enemy cannot walk into Misfortune's R, so their engage gets completely denied. But yeah, the most fun part is still teamfighting with Misfortune's ultimate. This is why you buy so much attack damage with your item build, so a well-aimed ER combo can win fights on the spot, and this is especially dangerous when the enemy is trapped in choke points. The more cluttered and messy, the better for Misfortune, and the only counterplay for the enemy is to simply not be in that situation in the first place. While these ultimates are super satisfying for the Misfortune player, you should expect your enemies to play around them. So for safe and consistent teamfighting, you effectively have two options. The first one is to use your ult at the beginning of a teamfight. This way you don't have to risk getting close to enemy solo laners, and after your ultimate's initial damage, you simply let lethal tempo do the rest. Even if these ultimates don't feel as satisfying, they are definitely enough to tip the scales in your favor. Remember, a lot of your power budget is in your auto attacks, and by ulting early, you will have an easier time keeping your lethal tempo stacks throughout the fight. It is simply a safe way to create a health advantage for your team, since you can stay at long range and force the enemy to disperse. And more often than not, your teammates will find a way to capitalize off of this. The positional advantage you create with these early ults must not be underestimated. You effectively squash every opportunity for your opponents to make proactive plays themselves, while your team can remain firmly grouped together and then plow through the enemy's scattered ranks. The second option Misfortune has for teamfighting is essentially your fallback level. Pressing R is inherently risky for you, since you effectively root yourself in place for 3 seconds, and against some champions this is simply not viable. Some would just jump on you and kill you, and others have a very easy time simply interrupting your ultimate. For lethality Misfortune this is a disaster, but crit Misfortune can switch gears and just play the teamfight like a traditional hypercarry. Especially during these later stages of the game, you stack lethal tempo very fast, and your DPS with Kraken Slayer and all the attack speed can kill anyone. MissFortune actually has very good mobility with W, and this is also why you take the rune Overheal, so you get to keep your W move speed for as long as you are shielded. While you channel your ult, you are a skill shot magnet, but while running around, you can dodge them all. It is entirely possible to carry a team fight exclusively with your auto attack damage, since lethal tempo will always take over eventually. Champions with strong gap closers that you cannot outplay with your movement speed are probably MissFortune's biggest weakness. Rengar and Hecarim come to mind, for example. But you can still counter them with Bloodthirst as second item, so make sure to adjust your build accordingly. When you see these champions on the enemy team during champ select, however, you can of course alternatively pick Nilah AD carry, since Nilah counters all in. If this sounds interesting to you, you can access a full Nilah guide as well by clicking the link on your screen right there.